Okay, so Marxism is the notion that we need system change, that capitalism is a system that has fundamental flaws, that those flaws show up in the difficult conditions imposed on the majority of people, the employees as opposed to the employer class, and that Marxism names those flaws, much as the abolitionists in slavery named the fundamental flaw of the system as being what happens if you make a human being into a piece of property like a donkey or a tractor or something else. And the Marxist argument was that capitalism visits on people three fundamentally intolerable conditions. Number one, an endless production of inequality. Marx has a famous line in which he writes, "Capitalism is indeed a system that produces and reproduces great wealth. But it unfortunately is a system that produces great wealth at one pole and great poverty at another. It is as efficient in producing one as it is in producing the other. The poor will always be with us" may have been an idea concocted long before capitalism, but capitalism is trapped in a way of producing inequality that is socially antagonistic, disruptive, and fundamentally unfair. The second criticism Marxism levies against capitalism is that it is intolerably unstable. Wherever capitalism settles, every 4 to 7 years, it has a quote-unquote recession or depression or economic downturn. Lots of phrases for something that happens so often. Suddenly, people who need a job to produce goods and services we need to consume are thrown out of work. Businesses die. People suffer unemployment, which of course is immediately shared with their families and their communities. Sometimes these are short and shallow, but often these downturns cut deep and last a long time, like the great one of the 1930s, called the Great Depression, or the one we've been living with since 2008, called the Great Recession. An economic system that unstable is an economic system that literally screams out, at least to Marxists, as being something that we can do better than. That is a system that we can and should criticize and that we should replace with one that does not permit large numbers of people to be thrown out of work when they need the jobs and we need the goods and services they can produce. And if we don't need those goods and services, then let's give those people a job with shorter hours so that they have the leisure without being unemployed, which is where the suffering begins. And the final argument of the Marxists is that a system that creates great inequality and then imposes suffering through its instability is a system that is therefore unjust, because the greatest sufferers in all the ups and downs of capitalism are the bottom half or the bottom 2/3 of the population. They're the last hired, they're the first fired. They're the ones with the low income, they're the ones who take it on the chin. So that the argument of the Marxists is, we can do better. History hasn't stopped with capitalism. If capitalism was an improvement, which Marxists generally believe, over the slavery and the feudalism that existed beforehand, it also can be improved upon, and nobody should be allowed to shut down the conversation that Marxists insist on, that we can, we should, we need to do better, to find a system that works better.
Welcome back to the Millennial-Review, the podcast where we analyze the current political, cultural, and socioeconomic crises we face from the perspective of the most indebted and disenfranchised generation in history. My name's Trevor, here with a solo episode. Before we begin today, consider joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/millennial-review. You get access to bonus episodes, you get access to our Discord, and you allow us to keep this project to continue to function and be financially independent. So today we are going to cover Marx, we're going to cover Capital, and specifically the first 3 chapters of the book, which are notoriously known as the most difficult 3 chapters. The reason why so many people start reading Marx and then stop is because the first 3 chapters are difficult to get through and often hang people up. So I am going to help us get through that today, hopefully in a way that's useful to you. And that's really the purpose of this podcast. Disclaimer before we begin that Marx is very contentious. Reading Capital is very contentious. A lot of people have different interpretations of it. As you might suspect, people get really angry at other people's interpretations. We know this is how things work on the left, and I would say this is among the most contentious of the topics, and certainly the most contentious of the text. It's also, of course, important to note that I am no expert on the topic. To be a true expert on Marx, you have to understand economics and philosophy at a much deeper level than I do, and certainly there is an array of other experts out there that you should go to if you want a really strict reading of the text. The purpose of this podcast is not to dissect every word. We could easily do hours and hours and hours on each chapter. I've seen, YouTube videos that are 4 hours long just going through chapter 1. These are things that certainly happen in the academic world, but I don't think that really serves us very well. I think Marx should be used to be translated as he would have wished to be, as he explicitly wished to be, to working people who could understand him. He never wanted to write anything that regular people could understand because, of course, the outcome of his politics was supposed to be a working class revolution. And it's pretty hard to have a revolution of an educated working class if they don't understand your writing. So that was always Marx's purpose. And I think in the spirit of Marxism, I'm going to try to simply break things down on a level that are understandable and isn't trying to be too abstract, because that just really doesn't serve anybody's interest, which of course isn't to say that it shouldn't be done. If you have the time and the desire, I think reading Marx is extremely valuable, and trying to really dig through is extremely valuable. I think in general, reading any really difficult book, even if it can seem frustrating and at times pointless because, the words aren't going into your brain the way they do during a normal book, it's a really useful process to just struggle through something that is very difficult to understand. So I think that's a valuable thing to do in and of itself, but that is not what we're going to do today. And again, that doesn't make for good podcasting. So I'm going to try to break down the ideas that are the most useful and try to bring in a bunch of examples in the modern world that will really help you understand how Marx conceived of capital and how we can update Marx. And that's one thing that needs to be noted as well, is that we need to update Marx. There are too many people who try to read Marx directly into our current moment, which just does not make a lot of sense. We have an economy that is completely shifted from the one that Marx existed in, and even the one that he envisioned heading into the future. It's just totally different in so many different ways. So to try to directly relate Marx to the internet, really, it's useful, and we should take his insights, but we also have to realize that we have to work within his frameworks, but to update them to a way that actually makes sense to our modern world, because again, the purpose is to actually act. So before we dive in, we have to go through the concept and the topic of dialectics. I know some of our listeners will be smiling hearing me say that, or laughing, one of the two. But dialectics is pivotal to understanding Marx. You really can't read Marx without dialectics, because not only is he an advocate of dialectics, not only does his system revolve around dialectics, but he writes very dialectically. And what that really means is he builds up topics, he takes them in isolation, and then he takes them as a whole, and then he picks them apart again and goes back and forth and back and forth. I think that's what makes him so difficult to read. But it's also really unique in that if you can get through that, if you can read him in that way and understand what he's doing at all times, that, okay, we're taking this piece, which might seem in a contradiction with something else, and then he's going to relate it back, and then he's going to loop them all together. But then just when you think that you've gotten the entire concept, he's going to break it back down. I think if you go through that process, you will understand things better than almost any way of learning things, because we live in a world that is fundamentally contradictory. And so to not treat it as such means that we don't come to conclusions that actually sort of deal with the world as it is. So dialectics really began with Plato and Kant. They began talking about this dialectical process and this idea of contradiction. They talked about it in a much different way than Hegel would later. And in fact, they saw contradiction as a major problem in trying to identify epistemology, which just means what we can know. That if things were contradictory, that means that they couldn't be known to be true. This is especially evident in Kant. This is sort of the foundation of his epistemological belief. He believed in the principle of non-contradiction. And maybe for the first time in my life, the simple mathematical expression here is probably the most simple way to talk about the principle of non-contradiction, which just says that A cannot both equal B and not equal B. So rather than try to spell this out in sort of logical form, let's just ask a question. Are you the same person that you were when you were 15 years old? Under the principle of non-contradiction, the answer has to be no. You can't both be the same person you were when you were 15 and not be that person. But that doesn't really accord with our experiences, does it? Like, you are the same person you were when you're 15 and you're not. Those things are both true. We cannot separate them and say, I am a different person now than when I was 15, because clearly part of your identity was built through being 15 years old. There is no you without the 15-year-old. So we cannot say that just because there's a contradiction here, that makes it untrue. So this is where Hegel comes along, and he says not only is non-contradiction a myth, that yes, A can equal B and not equal B, not only can they, that's the way of the world. That's the only way to understand the world, is that all things are contradictory. Subjectivity is contradictory. And importantly, Hegel brings dialectics to a teleology, which simply means there is a purpose to the phenomena. So contradictions are actually driving the world forward. We can't have quote-unquote progress, which just means literally the world continuing to function, without having contradictions. They are the fundamental state of the world. This is a huge shift, and this is why Hegel was so influential, because it's such a divergence from the ideas of logic that preceded it. So let's take immigration, for example. Conservatives will say that immigrants are at once lazy and extremely hardworking to the extent that they're taking all of our jobs. Kant would say that this exposes the shallowness of truth in the thinker, i.e. the conservative, because it's a violation of non-contradiction. The immigrant can't be lazy and hardworking at the same time. Hegel would say, actually, what the conservative says is true, and in fact, it's true for all of us. We are all at once lazy and hardworking. This is the human condition. And this is important because it's a rejection of dualism. So take issues of feminism, right? Under a system of patriarchy, what's often put forth is a dualist vision of women. Either you're a prude or you're a slut. The problem with liberal feminism is that in many ways it rejects dualism for singularism. You, the woman, are a strong, powerful badass. In fact, from the Hegelian position, this is the problem. The problem is that you don't try to allow women to be all things, to be fully human, to have both sides to their personality, to have both sides to their behavior. You're trying then to put them into a singular box, albeit one that's empowering for them. But is that really what we want to see from feminism? Do we want to see feminism mean that women are just all badasses? Think about glass ceiling politics. It just says every woman can strive to be president of the United States, or to be a member of Congress, or to be a CEO, or even to be a social worker. Dialectical feminism says that women can be whatever they aspire to be, whatever they become, whatever the result is of the contradictory nature of their subjectivity, the same thing that men have always had. Another example to sort of spell this out is one of my favorite fields of study in economics, which is what it means to be clutch. So those of you that watch sports, you'll know what I mean in terms of clutchness, right? At the end of the game, which players step up and perform at a high level. This has mostly been studied in basketball just because it's the most obvious, and that's good for me because that's my favorite sport. So we think about players as clutch because, like, in the last 2 minutes, you want to give this guy the ball and he's going to score. What the data actually finds, what the experiments actually find, is that there is no such thing as a player being clutch. Every single player's shooting percentage drops when it comes to clutch time, right? There's nerves, the fans are going crazy, it's high stress, nobody gets better. The only difference is the quote-unquote clutch player gets slightly less worse than everybody else. But you can see here where the mistake comes in. We think in dualist terms often. So we say there is this clutch player who is performing at a high level and then everybody else. To reject that position and to advocate a dialectical position, in this kind of silly example of sports, but one I think that spells it out, is that the player is in relation to his team and the players on the other team. You can't measure one individually. So clutchness doesn't mean that you get better. It just means that in relation to everybody else, you don't perform worse. Here's another example that will be controversial, and that's this idea of ACAB. Under a Hegelian framework, ACAB isn't right. There is no dualist position between a good cop and a bad cop. The cop has both good features and bad features, but they're all parts of a whole. which is a rotten institution with every incentive to be bad. So then a question that comes up through Hegelian dialectics is, what does it mean to be an individual? Hegel says you only come to know yourself through others. Your own ego and identity are the result of a dialectic and contradictions between yourself and the universe and the friends around you and your nature and your nurture. All these things play into creating you. The idea that you, the individual, become yourself doesn't make a lot of sense. And again, the important thing here is that the logical contradiction is equal to an ontological contradiction. There's some purpose to all of this. There's some reason for negation. There's some reason for contradiction, or else we wouldn't have the universe. Hegel literally brings this to science. He talks about the Big Bang as if it itself was a contradiction, and all the forces of the universe are in contradiction to one another. And that's pretty consistent with what we know about science, what we know about physics, right? The universe is a contradictory system that nonetheless continues to strive forward, meaning it has some teleology, it has some reason for being. That contradictions aren't just this accident. Contradictions are how history happens, how natural science happens, and how subjective human experience happens. And one of the big keys here and the big misunderstanding of Hegel is that we don't solve contradictions except for realizing that everything is in contradiction. Contradictions are inevitable. We cannot escape them. Only through realizing that this is the way that the world works can we actually move it forward. And so this is where many people think Marx is wrong, because Marx says that capitalism will wither under the weight of its own contradictions, and then socialism will be created after its collapse. Hegel would say, no, capitalism doesn't resolve itself into a classless society. It just generates new contradictions. In other words, Marx thinks that there's going to be some moment of defeat for capitalism. Hegel says that's silly. That's a resolving of contradictions, and contradictions are never resolved. And this gets into some really interesting questions. I think Zizek is one of the best at probing this very issue. So Zizek thinks that status differences under communism would be even worse than under capitalism. And he makes a pretty strong argument, right? Because now, if I have better outcomes than you can blame the system, rightfully. You can blame capitalism. You can blame the fact that my parents gave me an inheritance, the fact that I was able to go to good schools, the fact that I had healthcare growing up, the fact that I didn't have lead in my water, yada, yada, yada. In a perfectly egalitarian society, achieving full communism, there's no class, there's no distinctions. What does it mean when you have better outcomes than I do? Then it's just my own fault. If there was no system in the way that created these outcomes, it was just my own lack of ability or tenacity or what have you. These are serious contradictions. And there is a really good case to be made that the contradictions under socialism and communism would be just as bad, if not worse in some ways. Think about the issue of death. As morbid as it is, under capitalism, death means one thing. And for a lot of people, death means a release from a world that was really fucking hard for them. So nobody wants to die necessarily, but that doesn't mean that death is as bad as it could be if you're in a system where you have to struggle every day to feed your family. Again, in some ways, there's this idea of release. But what if we create a perfect society? What if we create a perfectly egalitarian society? Then what does death become? What if life is amazing? What if we reach utopia and life is perfect here on Earth? Doesn't death become 10 times worse, 100 times worse than it is right now? Isn't that an entirely new contradiction where we might spend our whole life being afraid of death because we don't want to leave this world even to relieve some suffering that we have to go through every day? That's a brand new problem. And that's the Hegelian difference from Marx, that there is no resolution. Another really interesting way to talk about this is this idea of the social contract. So Hegel rejected Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau because he argued there is no political individual. Because through the act of collectively forming the state, that's what generates a political identity. So you can't socially contract with the individual because the individual, at least as a political identity, is created through the creation of the state. That's the dialectic that creates the individual. So the idea that you can contract with somebody outside of the state that has some autonomy to decide what laws are just or what have you really doesn't make sense as a framework. Final example before we jump into Marx is this contradiction of unemployment. So we have a system that needs to hold unemployment under a certain level to keep society functioning. But at the same time, the unemployed are socially necessary for capitalism to function. You have to have a reserve labor force in order to control wages. So in other words, those who are unemployed are both necessary to the system. You literally have to have them. Economists talk about a natural state of unemployment that allows the system to continue to function. But they're also lazy parasites. We don't want them, but we need them. Okay, so hopefully that's a sufficient explanation to give you an overview of dialectics. Obviously, it's an incredibly complex topic that could be discussed for hours and hours and hours, but hopefully that gives you enough of a framework for understanding what we're about to go through with Marx and the way that he operates. Of course, if there's any more questions about dialectics that people really want me to dive into, I'm happy to do so. Okay, so let's begin with chapter 1. Marx starts out with the commodity, which is an interesting choice and a cause of frustration. There are a bunch of different places that Marx could have started. He could have started with money. He could have started with labor, but he decides to start with the commodity. This has frustrated a lot of people because it's a kind of a weird place to just jump in the story. It feels like you're kind of in the middle of the economy. But of course, this is exactly how Marx intended it. He wanted you to start at this sort of microscopic level, and then he's going to pull you out to 30,000 feet, and he's going to take you back down again and back out again. That's how his writing sort of operates, and it really is a beautiful thing. Okay, so what is a commodity? A commodity fills a human want, need, or desire. We take possession of it and we make it ours. It thus has use value to us, important term, use value, or, quote, the usefulness of a thing. So, simple commodity, right? You have a use value for apples. You want an apple, you have a use value for it, which is to eat it, and therefore you are willing to enter into the market to get that. So Marx says everything is in principle exchangeable with everything else. Commodities get their value in relation to one another, meaning they are commensurable with one another. This means that as a commodity form, there is no real distinction between a peach and a shoe and a Lamborghini. They're all commodities in relation to one another. Think about how the cost of living is calculated through staple goods. You might not actually consume any of these things, but your income relative to them determines your position. This is a good way to illustrate what we mean by all commodities being commensurable with one another. Marx then moves on to exchange value. And again, this is a strategy. Dissect things individually and then relate them to the whole. Use value and exchange value are in conflict because they have to be in reference to something else. So Marx writes, as they exchange values, commodities differ in quantity and therefore do not contain an atom of use value. So what does this contradiction mean? How can a good be of exchange value without use value to the person who owns it? In other words, I have a hat, but I don't wear hats. I'm trying to exchange them to somebody who has a use value for a hat. So I don't have any use value for that hat, but it has to have use value to somebody else for me to exchange it. Okay, and again, it's going to seem like we're bouncing around because this is how Marx writes, but hopefully it will wrap itself together in the way that I explain it. So Marx says what all commodities have in common is that they are all bearers of the human labor that went into their production. Now the question is, what kind of labor? The key here is that it's not concrete labor. In other words, it's not the 8 hours of work that you actually produce to make the thing, but instead human labor in the abstract. Marx calls this phantom-like objectivity because it becomes an objectivity in the market, but it's not actually representing the real thing, i.e. the labor that you did to produce that item. So there are phantoms in the supermarket. You cannot see the labor. So what do we mean by phantom-like labor as opposed to objective or concrete labor, i.e. I worked 8 hours to produce this? Marx spells this out as, quote, socially necessary labor time, i.e., quote, the labor time required to produce any use value under the conditions of production normal to a given society and with the average degree of skill and intensity of labor prevalent in society. He further writes that it's, quote, determined by a wide range of circumstances. It is determined, amongst other things, by the worker's average degree of skill, the level of development of science and its technological application. So it doesn't matter if I take 20 hours to knit a coat. 20 hours of labor are not going to be embodied in the actual value of the commodity, but instead the societal average. So if in the United States we have advanced knitting technology and a workforce that works pretty quickly, the socially necessary labor time to produce that coat might be 12 hours instead, and that's going to determine the value. Maybe in India or Canada or Paraguay, they have less advanced technology and, quote, lazier workers, and their socially necessary labor time is 24 hours. So there are three concepts here. There's use value, which is the usefulness of a thing, filling some need, want, or desire that you have as an individual. There's exchange value, which is you selling something that you do not have use value for to somebody else who does have a use value for it. And then these two things are embedded into value, which is basically the price that you see in the supermarket. These things are all separate from one another, but they're all interconnected in a way that cannot be separated. They all are necessary to the other. Marx calls exchange value, quote, the necessary mode of expression or form of appearance of value. You have to be able to sell it to someone somewhere. It has to have use value for someone else. So in other words, value cannot exist without exchange value, and exchange value cannot exist without use value for somebody else. David Harvey uses the example of a house for use and a house for flipping. It becomes of non-use value to you when you decide to flip the house, but of course is useful to somebody else, fulfills a want, need, or desire for them. This is a dialectic. Exchange value, use value, and value are codependent but separate at the same time. You can't have exchange value without use value. You can't have use value for the commodities you need without going through exchange. And then value requires both exchange value and use value, but is also separate from them, namely through labor. That's what value brings into the equation. It's a representation of the labor, socially necessary labor, that went into making that product. So then we turn to the issue of how exchange actually operates. And here we get into commodity equivalence and then what becomes the universal equivalent, right? So a commodity equivalent, one coat equals 200 yards of linen equals 2 ounces of gold. Gold becomes the medium of exchange. In other words, an index that everything is relative to. And gold really makes sense as a medium of exchange because it basically has purely exchange value. It doesn't really have serious use value to anyone. It's a shitty soft metal. You can't really turn gold into anything. It's important to note here that you don't create a commodity by picking an apple or growing weed to smoke for yourself. That's purely of use value to you. A commodity is a thing that is desired for use value. In other words, and this is somewhat in contradiction, the thing has to have use value to somebody else to be a commodity. If I pick an apple and eat it, it's not a commodity. If I pick the apple and satisfy someone else's use value by selling it to them, it then becomes a commodity. And the key point here is that we can't know anything about the value of a commodity by its own character, only in relation. You can't dissect a thing and know what value it has in it. It has to be in relation to all other commodities. Marx writes, quote, quantities of iron serve to measure the weight of the sugar and represent, in relation to the sugar loaf, weight in its pure form, the manifestation of weight, end quote. But of course, the value of commodities go beyond the physical. The difference between the value of a coat and the 20 yards of linen used to produce it is a, quote, supranatural property, end quote, which is, quote, something purely social. Marx then writes, quote, value, therefore, does not have its description branded on its forehead. It rather transforms every product of labor into a social hieroglyphic. And this is essentially what the pricing system is. I think that's a really beautiful way to try to understand how pricing actually occurs in the marketplace. It's a social hieroglyphic. It's an abstraction. There's no objective value in and of itself. It is labor that becomes transformed and then becomes valued in some way. But that process is opaque to us and becoming more so as our economy becomes more globalized, as we'll talk about shortly. So the value of commodity A is qualitatively expressed by direct exchangeability of commodity B with commodity A. Obviously, this quickly scales. My commodity, say my iron ore, has exchangeability with all kinds of different commodities in the marketplace. I can trade it for corn or tea or gold or pants, at least in their quantitative or qualitative equivalent. The expanded form of commodity exchange becomes a, quote, general form and eventually a universal equivalent. It's at this point the emergence of a trade system, as opposed to a bartering system, in which a money commodity arises. This facilitates market exchange at scale. In the US, the money commodity was gold, but it's been different throughout history. Marx concludes chapter 1 with the pivotal distinction between use value and exchange value. A chemist can't figure out the value of a diamond. You can't dissect it and find its value. There's no value within the diamond. Its value comes in the labor necessary for extraction, its use to man, and the social process of exchange with other commodities. Circling back to labor. For labor to be socially necessary, somebody must want, need, or desire the commodity. Concrete labor, the actual act of labor that you do to produce the commodity, versus abstract, which is socially relevant labor. These things are clearly linked, but not the same. Not only does an individual's concrete labor not seriously matter in determining value, but even the production process as a whole is disconnected. What if a union forms and decides it's only going to make X units per week? Well, if this was the norm across the entire society, then value would shift. But what actually happens is the corporation is likely to just lose money by having to pay more for labor, but only getting the value of the socially relevant labor of the entire society to produce that good. So if we produce textiles and we decide to form a union, the value of those textiles don't change because we decided to form a union. Our labor practices might, how much time we take to make those textiles might, but that's not what's actually being valued. What's being valued is, across society, what is the average time taken to produce a textile. It's here that Marx makes a particularly controversial claim, which is that all labor is essentially the same, that complex labor is just intensified or multiplied simple labor. So Marx would say making the shirt embodies the labor, as does picking an orange, as does coding in Excel. These are all just scales of complexity of the exact same thing. I won't get into the debate over that, but it's useful to note there is a debate over what it means to have highly skilled labor and how that differs the value of products. Marx calls value immaterial but objective. Value is a social relation, and it's never fixed but fluid. This is important too. Value is constantly changing, literally daily in the market. That's why it doesn't make sense to really talk about some equilibrium under classical economic models, because these things change constantly. The market is fluid. Value is fluid. There is no value of a thing that remains constant over time, because the forces of society, political, technological, social, are constantly changing. And so value has to change. If value is a representation of labor, and labor is constantly undergoing changes in the process of production through all the different facets that come to make up what the factory looks like, what the individuals look like, do they have health care? How much are they able to work? Do they get sick? Who's showing up to work? Are they getting educated and getting more highly skilled over time? This creates constant fluidity. And so there is no set value of a thing. But again, this idea of value being immaterial but objective is important, because value, being immaterial, cannot exist without a mean of representation. This is the rise of money as the form of the tangible expression. Marx writes, quote, "Human labor creates value, but is not itself value. It becomes value in its coagulated state, in objective form." So essentially, value becomes objectified, even though it's not an objective thing. There is no material value you can point to. So again, circling back as Marx does, he says that use values equal physical, material, space, and time. Right? I actually eat the apple. I actually wear the pants. I'm actually consuming this for my use. This is a real process. Exchange value, on the other hand, is not objective in space and time or material. It's relative and constantly in motion to the world market. Obviously, again, more so today than it was when Marx was writing this. This leads to the rise of what Marx calls commodity fetishism. And commodity fetishism means something very specific. I think that it's easy to take this concept as like, we just all love stuff, man. But that's not what he's talking about. Commodity fetishism means that you cannot see the labor that went into producing the chicken you buy because it's abstracted from production, and doing so is literally impossible. There's no possible way to see an object and know the kind of labor that went into it, but it has a value, but you don't know where that value came from, right? So we fetishize commodities because they get abstracted. It's an abstract thing. We create value through our own mental processes almost, right? It translates from pricing in the market to a real thing, even though it's been disconnected from what it's actually represented, which is the labor that went into making it. Therefore, social relations between people is disguised in relationship between things, i.e. in this case, chicken and money. This masks social relations, i.e. labor and conditions. This is a key distinction that will develop into a theory of alienation. So you can think about a commune as an alternative where you can see the entire production process, right? Any communal living where we're producing things for each other, that's sort of an ideal form where you're able to constantly see the labor, and then value makes a lot more sense, right? I saw that, Nick worked this hard on creating this commodity and Stacy worked this hard on creating this commodity, and therefore I actually have some connection to the value. Nick didn't work that hard. He just collected the berries and he put them into a basket and he made it look nice, and so I'm going to pay him a few bucks for that. But Stacy was over there hammering that iron all day long, and she created this beautiful product that she's been working on for 3 days, and so therefore that clearly has a lot more value than the berries that were just picked off the tree for little labor. That's the kind of connection that I think in an ideal society we would like to see, because then value actually means something and we want to value things appropriately. But the trick of capitalism is to abstract that completely, so we have no idea. Maybe this product was made in excellent working conditions where the person was paid well and was very happy and enjoyed the process and felt love in the process. Or maybe they were working in a sweatshop. That is almost never known under capitalism. And this is a really important distinction because under classical economics, the labor that went into making a product has nothing to do with its pricing, really. And that's important to note. That sets Marx apart from the economist of his time. So the question here becomes, what has value? If I bring my unique arts and crafts that took me hundreds of hours and they don't sell, does that thing have exchange value? No, because it didn't have value to somebody else. Under capitalism, that thing has no value no matter how hard you worked on it. On the demand side, if I don't have money, then I don't have any use value for the other person's exchange value. Someone wants to sell me a laptop. I'm a college student that really needs a laptop, but I don't have that money. So therefore, I don't have use value in the market, even though it would clearly fill a need, want, and desire for me. What about childcare? What about taking care of my grandparents? What about these social reproductive functions that aren't actually compensated because they don't have a use value to a consumer in the marketplace? So I like how Marx finishes chapter 1, which is to say that value is like gravity. It's a relation and not a thing, and it's immaterial but objective. It becomes objectified in the marketplace, and it's constantly fluid, but there's no actual graspable value. You can't dissect something and find its value within it. Okay, moving on to chapter 2. Chapter 2 honestly isn't super important. A lot of it's just heading off arguments from critics, which makes sense but doesn't lend itself to riveting reading. Marx begins chapter 2 by reiterating that a commodity being exchanged cannot have use value for the seller or else they wouldn't be selling it. Conversely, it must have use value for the consumer or they would not be buying it. And remember, exchange value is determined by relation to other commodities. Marx is continually repeating these things on purpose, by the way. This is how he meticulously builds up the dialectic. It's tough because we keep going back and forth, but it also offers a deep understanding. So let's return to the universal equivalent that is money, right? It started out as gold, so what about dollar bills and credit cards today? Whereas classical economists say that money's value is imaginary, Marx contends that it is a symbol. But all commodities are symbols of the socially necessary labor time to produce them. He writes, the physical object, gold or silver in its crude state, becomes, immediately on its emergence from the bowels of the earth, the direct incarnation of human labor, hence the magic of money, end quote. So the free exchangeability of commodities means they become externalized from social relations. The more globalized we become, the more true it becomes. Today, we don't even have a conception of who produced the things for our use value. So here's a question. Where did your shirt come from? More pointedly, what does this even mean? There's a book called The Travels of a T-Shirt that I read, I think, my freshman year of college, that tracks this very phenomenon throughout the global economy, tracing it from its origin to its sale. You can have cotton grown in Turkey, milled in Mexico, sewn in El Salvador, etc., etc. H&M collects data on their sourcing and finds that their clothing comes from around 800 different factories. So if you look on the back of your shirt and it says made in Guatemala, that just means that Guatemala was along the supply chain. Virtually no shirt is made in one country anymore. Marx writes, quote, "The money form is merely the reflection thrown upon a single commodity by the relations between all other commodities," end quote. Again, this just becomes hyper abstract in the context of globalization, in the context of a shirt going to 7 different countries before it arrives at the mall that you go to shop at and ends up in your closet. Here, Marx introduces money fetishism as an antecedent to commodity fetishism. And remember, fetishism in Marxist language here is essentially saying representing something in an idealized form that is extracted from what it actually is. Quote, "What appears to happen is not that a particular commodity becomes money because all other commodities universally express their value in it, but on the contrary, that all other commodities universally express their value in a particular commodity because it is money." End quote. So let's synthesize here. We go from labor being put into a product, that product only having exchange value if it fulfills a want, need, or desire for somebody else, and the pricing of that product being the socially necessary, basically average within a context, the context of the country and social conditions, etc., the socially necessary labor time put into making it. This pricing leads to commodity fetishism, where the actual production process becomes completely abstract, phantom-like, to the buyer. And then, this money gets represented by currency, which even further abstracts even the process of market exchange between buyers and sellers by representing this entire process through an abstract, intangible, but objective commodity called money. Further, money then becomes a thing to produce in and of itself, which we discuss in Chapter 3. Marx ends Chapter 2 by saying that money is an externalization of the contradictions between use values and exchange values, which is a really important summary of a lot of what we learned so far. Okay, Chapter 3, which is where Marx takes on the issue of money directly. He begins by taking classical political economy on its own assumptions, namely that of the free market functioning without distortion. So we don't need to talk about all the ways that there's not actually free markets and all the ways that capitalists use their power, blah, blah, blah. He just says, in its pure form, let's see if it actually functions the way that the classicists say that it does. This is a very Hegelian move. Hegel believed that the way to come at ideas was through their pure representation, and that through that, you could show how all ideas face incommensurable contradictions. The world is contradiction. So this is a powerful rejection of crony capitalism, the idea that like capitalism functions, but it's just become distorted. That's just nonsense. And you can see that by taking it in its idealized form and breaking it down, which Marx does expertly. So Marx says that all labor becomes valued through the commodity, and then this ultimate abstract commodity is the money form. Ultimate abstract in the sense that, like all commodities, it is an embodiment of labor, but in literally the most abstracted form. How much labor is in $5? The question makes no sense. Once all relations go through money, then money becomes the value in and of itself. This gives capitalists unique powers because they can hoard money. What does hoarding money mean? Well, in Marxist political economy, it means they can control that which is produced by labor. This is an extremely important idea. Dialectically, money is just another commodity. You could think of it as a collection of commodities as a mental shortcut, even though it wouldn't be quite right. So if labor is the driving force behind commodities, and you can control the universal equivalent, meaning money, you control labor, literally by definition. So money only has value through labor, but now labor also only has value through money. I'm going to repeat that again. Money only has value through labor, but now labor also only has value through money. Money is a representation of socially necessary labor time. So Marx takes the classical economists on their own terms and calls price an ideal, meaning under their models, price is essentially what you hope to get. In neoclassical terms, this is the result of supply and demand, that prices are determined by what sellers assume they might get from some product and what buyers assume they might buy it for. I think this is a big turning point where you start to see Marx's unique insight, especially if you've taken classes in economics in college. The assumption that prices are determined by some objective force of competitive equilibrium is genuinely magical thinking. Marx did agree that once a market develops, there becomes some equilibrium, but it's not the equilibrium price of objective supply and demand, but rather completely subjective forces that operate under their own logic. Why does a diamond cost as much as it does? It's not because of the natural laws of scarcity, but instead an abstract process of labor being subjectively valued through the marketplace. So money performs two different functions. It measures the value of human labor and creates a standard quantity of value with a fixed weight. Marx writes, quote, "But gold can serve as a measure of value only because it itself is a product of labor and therefore potentially variable in value. No matter how much the value of gold drops, the physical ratio stays the same, which makes it a good objective measurement. This allows for constancy in the economy. 12 ounces of gold is 12 times greater than 1 ounce of gold, no matter how much value the 1 ounce has." Marx says that price is the money name of the labor objectified in a commodity, and goes on to say that money is, quote, "itself a commodity, an external object capable of becoming the private property of any individual. Thus, the social power becomes the private power of private persons." We're creeping towards capitalism. Here he introduces CMC, commodity, money, commodity. A seller brings his linen to markets, exchanges it for money, which takes the shape of the linen's value, and then is taken out of this shape when exchanged for a Bible. I come with a commodity, I sell it for money, I buy another commodity. This is how the economy is supposed to constantly function. In other words, the value that the laborer gives the linen through his labor can only acquire social validity when exchanged for the money form. Not only could the commodity be unwanted by society, but, quote, "if the society's need for linen, and such a need has a limit like every other need, has already been satisfied by the products of rival weavers, our friend's product is superfluous, redundant, and consequently useless." So again, these things have to be connected to use value. If there is no use value for them in the market, maybe because it's saturated, they lose their exchange value from the person or the company trying to exchange them. So again, the CMC process, commodity, money, commodity, is a constant interconnected activity. Quote, "Being a seller and being a buyer are not fixed roles, but constantly attach themselves to different persons in the course of the circulation of commodities." End quote. In exchange, then, money is an abstract value that is role-playing both as a use value and an exchange value at different periods of exchange. When I sell, the money is an exchange value that I get from my commodity. When I buy, it's a use value for me getting something that I want to consume. So the quantity of the circulating medium, or money, is the sum of prices of commodities in circulation plus the velocity of the circulation, which is how often money changes hands. And thus is born circulation. The money does not vanish. Quote, "When one commodity replaces another, the money commodity always sticks to the hands of some third person." It's worth quickly noting here that Marx brings up intangibles like land prices, stock prices, and brands. He says these things are not priced based off of labor, so things can have a price without having a labor value, but these things are relational. These things do have prices, but their prices aren't based off of labor, thus they don't embody value the way other commodities do, but they are still relational. So they have price without having value. He never really got to expand on this as he planned to do later in his life, but it's sufficient to note that you can price things without labor embodied in them, and this brings up a whole new set of dialectics that new Marxists need to theorize in the modern economy. Okay, let's go back to the CMC process and break it down. Marx calls this the social metabolism of commodities. So first we go from C to M. This requires some social usefulness to the thing that you're selling. This is a commodity going to its universal equivalent. Next, we go from M to C, which is the universal equivalent to the particular commodity. This part is relatively seamless. It's easy to go with money and buy a commodity. It's hard to go with commodity and get money for it. In other words, it's easier to go from the universal to the particular than from the particular to the universal, which makes money so powerful. Again, important to know here that you go from being a seller to a buyer and back again, creating a circulation of the commodities process. But while commodities drop out of the marketplace, money keeps circulating. But this does not mean there's an equilibrium that traditional economics says there is. No one can sell unless somebody is willing to buy, but no one needs to buy directly if they have just sold. Traditional economics says perfectly competitive markets cannot have overproduction. Marx says bullshit. This is what a crisis is, because I can hold money. And if things are risky, I'm not holding my collection of shoes, I'm holding money. Think about trickle-down economics. Even without getting into MCM, which we will shortly, where capitalists transform money into more money, there is a liquidity trap of money holding. Enough of this leads to collapse of the capitalist system because you have to have constant circulation of both money and commodities for a functioning market. Key insight of Marx, and he was really the first to have this very insight, which we can all point to directly how this affects our economy, how we're constantly in danger of crisis because of circulation not functioning in this idealized sense. And thus rises hoarding. Under hoarding, you buy much and sell little, as Marx puts it. This is not inherently bad, actually, because it allows for market fluctuations to be managed. Pump money into the economy when there's not enough, pull it out when there's too much. But hoarding is a disruption of the general flow. Marx writes, quote, "This contradiction becomes the quantitative limitation and qualitative lack of limitation of money keeps driving the hoarder back to a Sisyphean task, accumulation," end quote. So you have an emerging class of hoarders, as well as an emergent banking system / government that has surplus wealth that they can adjust the circulation of the money supply with which to regulate the economy. And just to further spell out this idea of circulation and velocity, Marx writes, quote, "The velocity of the circulation of money is measured by the number of times the same piece of money turns over within a given period, and you need that to be basically as quick as possible." Then Marx uses that to build up to credit, or IOUs, essentially. This creates a whole new contradiction, because at least money in its basic form has to be backed up by labor. There's some inherent value in it as the universal form of a commodity, connected to use values, connected to things that we actually consume as people living in the economy. Now we have not just MCM for capitalists, which is money, commodity, money, but now we have MCM prime, where it's money, commodity, and then more money, specifically the idea of collecting interest. The emergence of interest is really a massive change in the history of capitalism, because now we're into accumulation, entirely disconnected from use values. And this is what Marx calls surplus value. You've probably heard of surplus value before. It's here. The capitalist isn't accumulating interest so he can buy 10,000 pairs of shoes. And this is unique to modern money. You can't turn gold into more gold, but you can turn money into more money, especially with the credit system. Thus is born lenders and debtors. Marx introduces the mean of payment in a credit situation. A home is a use value that is bought before it is paid for. The seller, or the creditor, accepts it as a means of payment. The more credit there is in a system means the more money being held from circulation, drastically increasing the likelihood of a crisis. The more an economy is built on credit, the more unstable it is. This is the biggest contradiction yet. Now money supposedly has value in and of itself for the very first time. This is the introduction of capital. This is literally why the book is named Capital. This also generates a much higher probability of generating crises. We are trusting capitalists to inject money into the system when it has too little, but obviously that's not even kind of the way that capitalists work. So now we're creating a system where crisis isn't just possible, but is constantly probable. If our system is based on the constant circulation of money, and we have a class of people who are hoarding it for its own sake to generate more and more without using any of it to buy commodities, the idea that we're going to have optimal circulation at any given time is highly unlikely. This is where you really start to see the brilliance of a guy writing in 1867 to predict the future. It really explains why our system is constantly in flux, not just having recessions every 5 to 7 years, which is the current law of capitalism, but in constant instability. Also, now capitalists are all in relation to one another. They've generated a class. In other words, not only does accumulation and credit generate the capitalist class in its sort of realized form, it immediately puts it in relation with itself. You essentially create wealthy class bourgeois solidarity. They're all working with one another to try to increase their capital. They're not in the world of commodities. Their purpose is no longer to serve the needs of an economy by providing commodities that people need, but instead just to increase money for themselves, and they spend their entire lives doing that. Again, this is a dramatic and rapid change in the economy that forever changes the world, and that creates our system that is so destabilized because it's based off, again, this is their own system. Marx isn't talking about crony capitalism. Marx isn't talking about monopolies. Marx is simply talking about the incentives of the system as they theorize it. Even in this perfect system, if you can turn money into more money, the point of capitalism is going to be to do that. There's no other reason not to. That is literally the point of capitalism. And so under conditions where you need constant circulation, where your entire system is built on money and commodities constantly flowing through the system, but you give incentives for people to literally take money out of the system, crisis is built into its idealized form. Crisis is built into its textbook form. The best possible things that you could possibly say about capitalism open themselves up to constant crisis. This is a really, really, really powerful move because we don't have to sit here and talk about all the ways in which capitalism is distorted. We don't have to talk about monopolies. We don't have to talk about any of that shit. We can talk about the system as it is and its own failures. And this is why Marx is so confident in his predictions and so confident in his worldview, because he dealt with the system on its own terms. So I think Marx wraps up chapter 3 in this discussion of money quite nicely when he says the contradictions between money as the measure of value and as the means of circulation allows for the possibility of capital. This is the rise of capitalism. It's not just about private ownership of the means of production. It's about accumulation. It's about the interest of consumers and capitalists being fundamentally in conflict in the creation of a class that is in relation to one another, that arises from all these dialectics and contradictions between use value and exchange value and prices in the marketplace, and how labor is embedded and what it means in a society to have socially necessary labor time, and how all these commodities get represented into the money commodity, and then that expands over time. This is how the system unfolds. That's the synopsis for chapters 1 through 3. Things get much more exciting from here on out, but this is an important foundation. Hopefully I have translated this well enough for you to understand. Again, if anybody has more questions about dialectics or about Marx or about how the system all functions, go ahead and shoot us a message and I can try to help translate more. Maybe you want to go deeper. I have resources, all that. And of course, I will continue along this series. I'm not sure which chapters we'll do next episode, but we're going to work our way through. So look forward to next time, and thank you for listening.